Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. In this week's show, I'm going to take a look at the astrology of the week starting September 28. And the most important astro event this week is a dramatic solar eclipse in Libra. So that's what I'll be talking about in today's episode. So let's get into the basics of the eclipse. It's a solar eclipse, which means this eclipse is happening at a new moon. So you might hear it referenced as a new moon eclipse or a solar eclipse. It's the same thing. And so the solar eclipse will be at 10 degrees of Libra, and it is happening on Wednesday, October the 2nd, unless you're in Australia, where that eclipse will arrive on October 3rd. Now, even though this is a new moon or a solar eclipse, one of the most important ways that I understand the energy of the eclipse is to consider which node the moon will be at the time of the eclipse. So will the moon be near the north node or the south node? And so this eclipse is a south node eclipse because the moon will be nearest to the south node, which of course is also in Libra right now. And so the themes of the South Node are going to really infuse into the energy of this eclipse. So what that means is that one of the main themes of this eclipse is about endings. There's a few other themes in there as well, and that's what I'm going to spend today talking about, as well as a few other tips about understanding the eclipse and working with it in your chart. Before we get too far into eclipse talk, if you're new to astrology and you want to learn the basics, my Practical Astrology beginner course is happening right now. I'll include the direct link to register in the show notes below, or you can pop over to kellysastrology.com and search for Practical Beginner Astrology. Okay, so let's get into this eclipse. I mentioned that this eclipse is about endings, and that is partly to do with this South Node influence that I want to share a little bit more about now. And it's also partly to do with the fact that this is going to be the last eclipse in Libra as part of this current cycle. So let's start with the South Node. The South Node is a point that is about release. It's about endings. It's about letting go. And it is about emptying out. It's about kind of purging or detoxing anything that's become toxic or congested, anything that's kind of like stagnant and stuck. We're trying to have that stuck energy or anything that's no longer really working well, we're trying to pass it out of our lives. And so if we understand that this eclipse is a South Node eclipse and it's about letting things go out of our lives or letting things go, I'm not going to keep playing this pattern with you, or I'm not going to keep fighting this fight with you, then we understand that this time, maybe 24 hours either side of the eclipse itself, is about moving things out of our lives rather than bringing things in. The South Node is about a few other things too. It is about shifting perspective. So the South Node is not a materialistic point. It is not ambitious in that worldly success kind of way. And so when the South Node is really emphasized, what we're really thinking about is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. I'm not going to benefit from it. It's just the right thing to do. Or we're also thinking about spirituality, because the South Node is a deeply spiritual, it's kind of more emotional and intuitive and felt. And so we're getting into those more, whether it's like intangible things, but also deeply spiritual and ritualistic things as well. And so you may notice that you're not interested as much this week in your worldly ambitions or the big goals that you set for yourself. And instead, maybe you just want to try and be a good person, or you're thinking about making a contribution that will help or support somebody around you in some capacity. So it's very much about, it's sort of like, I'm not prioritizing, me, or I'm not like making things better for me. I'm not carrying out my own ambitions. I'm instead just trying to participate in a collective space that maybe it is to my benefit, but is more importantly to the benefit of others. So, with this idea of the eclipse being a South Node eclipse, we're thinking about what can I stop? What am I ready to no longer participate in? What do I need to end? Or what is going to shift me towards a more meaningful or spiritual focus rather than just be like trying to fill life up in ambitious ways or worldly ways. So, this idea of the eclipse being non materialistic, it's less about stuff and more about connection for sure. The South Node can also be associated with events or experiences or with people and interactions that drain or deplete you, that kind of diminish your experience. And so, really pay attention to activities that you're doing or people that you're involved in where you really feel very exhausted or very spent or very emptied out after. That might be a clue that that situation is one that is taking more from you than you're getting back. And you may want to rethink how much energy or time you give to that situation or that person. So during this eclipse, you might actually get clear on someone or something that is taking too much from you, really, too more than you have to give. And that idea of where am I noticing that I'm really overwhelmed, or what am I doing right before I feel really low energy? And then maybe just recalibrating your exposure or your involvement with those draining or depleting people or circumstances. The idea of breaking patterns or letting things go as you kind of tune into your energy, your emotion, that more felt experience, it's really going to give you some wisdom that is like not coming from the intellectual brain. Now, speaking of all these South Node themes, in the days before the eclipse, particularly on Sunday, September 29, the Sun and Mercury are both going to pass over the South Node. And so there really is going to be a lot of finalizing and finishing and a lot of decisions made about endings this week in general between planets on the South Node on Sunday and then this big South Node eclipse on Wednesday. So it is a great week if you've been contemplating a choice or deliberating and going back and forward over a choice about should I stay, should I go, should I keep pushing, should I just kind of take a break and step back? The answer this week is take a break, step back, let it go. Now, I mentioned there were two reasons that this is an eclipse about endings. So it's the South Node, but the second reason is that this is our last eclipse in Libra. So in this current eclipse cycle, we started having eclipses in the sign of Libra back in October of 2023. That was when this sequence of South Node Libra eclipse began. And this eclipse, this October, is the last South Node Libra eclipse in Libra for this cycle. So that tells us a couple of things. There aren't going to be any eclipses in Libra for nearly 8 years. There actually aren't going to be South Node eclipses in Libra for nearly 18 years. So this particular energy of South Node eclipse in Libra has been very unique to this October 23 to October 2024 period. So there's been something about this last 12 months that each of us has been drawn into, like a process or a dance that is about South Node Libra experiences. And there's some general things there about changing our relationship patterns, but there's also going to be some chart specific things based on the topics of the Libra house in your chart, which we'll get into in a minute. And so the idea here at this endings piece is that for the last 12 months, you've been caught up in this cycle of trying to clue into what's draining you about the Libra part of your chart, and then to figure out how to clear out that draining stuff from your life. And this eclipse is sort of your final push to do that. What's the last thing I need to do? What can I try to negotiate or renegotiate? And even the things that seem like so impossible, like this is never going to happen, or this person or this organization is never going to engage me in a conversation about this thing, I would really encourage you to at least try to have that discussion. You might be surprised. So really thinking about the last 12 months for each of you, the South Node eclipses in Libra have been a lot about changing patterns and habits in relationship, figuring out how your own indecision is causing some tension or disconnect in relationship. Maybe figuring out how a tendency to people please or to compromise and keep the peace is disrupting your ability to more honestly and genuinely connect with other people. Now, this might be happening in a friendship, a work connection, a romantic connection, a family connection. The idea with the South Node eclipses in Libra is we're trying to be kind and respectful for other people, but we're learning the edge of how to be kind and respectful for others while still respecting and acknowledging the needs that you might have as an individual. So maybe you are rethinking a tendency to people please or to compromise. Maybe you've actually been trying to make things more fair between yourself and someone else. Maybe you've been speaking up about things that you've let slide in the past. And because this is an eclipse in an air sign, that dialogue and that conversation is so important. It doesn't mean you get it right in the first conversation, but it means you get the conversation going to try to figure out a more fair or equitable way of being in relationship with this other person, whether that's a romantic partner, someone at work, a friend, etc. Like all of our relationships have kind of been touched by this South Node Libra eclipse process. And, I did say, think about the topics of the Libra part of your birth chart. That's the house in your chart that has Libra on the cusp, and it could be any one of the 12 houses. Have you been clearing out clutter? Have you been getting rid of stuff? Have you been simplifying and just creating space around the topics of your Libra house? And what could be one final shift or clear out that you could do this week around that part of your chart or life? For instance, if Libra is your second house of money, income, cash flow, spendings, and budgets, maybe you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to be more thoughtful when I'm spending on X, Y, or Z, or I'm going to remove, this line item from my budget because I don't want to waste my money on that. So that's a very practical way. Maybe Libra is the 12th house for you, and you've been doing a lot of deep internal healing about worries or fears that you notice are interfering with your ability to be out in the world living life. So, whatever house it is, thinking about, is there something going on in this part of my chart or my life that isn't as good as it could be? And that I'm willing to do something to make it better. I'm willing to change a tendency. I'm willing to stop doing something. I'm willing to have a conversation that might be initially uncomfortable, but could lead to a more kind of fair, respectful experience in that area of my life. So there's a lot of themes there about the eclipse being on the South Node in Libra, about endings, and about the end of this 12-month pattern of eclipses in Libra. Now, this eclipse is in Libra, and that means that the ruler of the eclipse is Venus. At the time of the eclipse, you'll notice that Venus is in the next sign around in Scorpio. So there's a couple of things here. Venus, the eclipse ruler, is in her detriment place, and so she is not super well resourced. And so I do think this eclipse, between the sun being, blocked, its light being blocked, I'm going to say more on that in a minute, and Venus being in Scorpio, there's a couple of key planets in this eclipse that aren't at their best right now. And I think this eclipse is going to help reveal parts of our lives that are not as good as they could be, or that we want to make changes to make things better. Sometimes we need to know things are a bit wobbly, or there's a bit of a leak over here. Those things call your attention to make a repair or shore things up, or we can't just set and forget over there. We need to keep a more watchful eye for now. And so this eclipse in Libra ruled by Venus in Scorpio is Venus in Scorpio is really going to help with asking those maybe probing or confronting or uncomfortable questions, but helping you ask things to figure out what's really going on. Once you know what's really going on, then you can make a more long-lasting kind of solution or change. Now, because the eclipse rule of Venus is in the second sign from the eclipse, it is also going to highlight those monetary second house themes. And so there may be some financial matters that pop up for you around this eclipse based on the relationship of the eclipse ruler to the lunation itself. That might be that you're, rethinking your budget, you're reviewing income and earnings, you're looking at your expenditures. And if you're a little bit nervous or uncomfortable, this is definitely going to be a kind of invitation to simplify, to cut back where you can, or to look at how could I be more kind of internally aligned with the work that I'm doing. So, some of our big stuff around money could come up under this eclipse. It doesn't mean you'll have to fix all that in 24 hours. Our money stuff can be big, it can be entrenched, it can be have been around for a long time. But we want to bring that Venus and Scorpio investigative curiosity to, oh, isn't that interesting that because of this, then that? Or isn't it interesting that I never kind of put these links together, that this thing affects the money thing? So we can get some good background insight here. Now, I couldn't do an episode talking about an eclipse without talking about light and darkness and shadows. And that's because when we're in an eclipse, eclipses are a time when that light dark relationship changes. An eclipse is essentially a disruption of a regular pattern. And that's always important to keep in mind when we're in eclipse season, that regular scheduling could be interrupted or disrupted, at least temporarily. So we're all out of our regular rhythms and routines, just like the sun and the moon are as well. And so eclipses can invite reflection around maybe what's shadowy or what's often overlooked. What's just on the fringes of your awareness. It's not your main focus. You're like, I know it's there and I'll get to it at some point. This could be that some point. Symbolically, at a solar eclipse, the sun's light is blocked by the moon at the eclipse. And since the sun represents a number of things, this is really important. So some of the things the sun represents are leaders or figureheads, those kind of solar, high profile, highly visible, people that we look to. So like a political leader, a corporate leader, a thought leader, a spiritual leader, anyone in a position of perhaps authority and visibility and influence could be considered, a solar figure. And so when we have a solar eclipse, it can show that a leader or a figurehead is being blocked or even removed from power. So goes back to some of the ancient thinking about eclipses, that if the sun, the symbol of the king or the leader of the country or the region, if that is blocked, what does that mean for people occupying those leadership ruler positions? The sun at the time of this eclipse, this is a really tricky technical place for the sun, partly because it's eclipsed, partly because it's right near the south node, and partly because the sun is in one of its less stable signs in the sign of its fall, I beg your pardon, in Libra. And so the sun is really indicating that leaders are in this kind of wobbly, uncertain, unstable position. Maybe there are questions about leadership. So we can see some of this at a collective scale. And in fact, most of our literature around eclipses is about using eclipses to make forecasts about collective or mundane events. So more for the country rather than the individual. And so keeping those South Node themes in mind when you're applying this eclipse energy to your own chart is going to be the easiest, most direct way for you to get into how this eclipse might affect you. So if we think about this at a personal level, we know the sun is very wobbly. We know that the astro energy is very unstable. It might mean that you too are just feeling less sure of yourself, or that you're undergoing a period of uncertainty. And that may be applicable to the topics of the Libra part of your chart. It might also be showing up around the topics of Leo, the Leo house in your chart. And that's via the rulership method, where the sun represents or is responsible for what's happening in our Leo house. So either the Libra or the Leo parts of your chart could be a little wobbly, a little uncertain. You might be dealing with a period of things being unsettled around those areas of life. It doesn't mean that it's all bad and that everything's ending, but as much as things might be a bit wobbly externally, I'd really invite you to tune into what you are uncertain about within yourself. Even if you're not ready to act on that, or you don't want to say it out loud, at least acknowledge the truth to yourself. Like, I'm not sure about this job. or about this lifestyle choice, or about this friendship, or about this relationship. I'm not sure if I want to have this dynamic with this family member, for instance. So at least give yourself that space to acknowledge where you have questions and where you're maybe, not sure of how you want things to be going forward. And so hopefully you're starting to get the sense that eclipses are very poignant and very potent energies, but they're often very unsteady energies too. And so the astrology energy in general around this eclipse, you could think 24 hours before and after the eclipse. So if it's on the second or the third for you, just think about a day before and a day after. It is definitely a more unstable, uncertain time. And in a very practical, energy of the week kind of vibe, it might be that your plans are in flux or that you're not sure what you really want. And with this type of South Node eclipse, if you're not sure, it's better to opt to not do the thing yet. You can always change your mind in the future, but this is very much a less is more kind of piece. Now, one other important point to note about eclipses is that vital energy, the life force energy, can be reduced during an eclipse. The symbolic thinking here is like the cosmic dragon of the nodes is eating the sun or the moon, and the sun or the moon are where we get our vital life energy. And so, with the dragon eating the light of the sun, it's sort of as though our physical health can be temporarily disrupted or impaired as well. And so, since the vital energy is not great during an eclipse, it's really important to get extra rest, to maybe go at a slower pace, to choose food or movement practices that are going to be very nourishing, lots of like home cooked meals or nutrient rich meals, and movement that is maybe more in the low intensity, gentle piece. Obviously, movement is great for our body, but we don't want anything too stressful or too intense right now because the energy is so intense that our body is just going to need a little bit of cushioning to be with this energy. One thing I always think about during a solar eclipse is that it's as if the more conscious or clear parts of yourself, as represented by the sun, are blocked. And instead, we kind of have to tune in to the more intuitive, energetic, or felt wisdom that we have. So instead of like looking and seeing or thinking and knowing, we're sort of like intuiting and sensing. And what is the feeling? And oh, I've got butterflies, or I've got that stone pit feeling. So we're trying to live from a place of that shadowy nighttime wisdom. If you're familiar with the doctrine of sect from ancient astrology about daytime versus nighttime and light versus darkness, eclipses bring us into that nighttime dark wisdom. And so you may or may not be comfortable with that, but to kind of operate from that more intuitive or energetic part of ourselves, it's more instinctive rather than objective. You're going to need extra time. You'll move more slowly. If you're feeling your way around a dark room or a room with your eyes closed, you will go more slowly than if your eyes are open and the lights are on. And it's also a time when events and kind of decisions are not as clear or straightforward. And so if you don't have to make a decision on the day of the eclipse, I would recommend giving yourself a good 24 hours after the eclipse before you come back and finalize or agree to things. Instead of trying to begin or to build under this eclipse is much better for things like rest and release. So opting to let go, to stop the fight, to drop the argument, to pull back, to reconsider, that is going to be just a much more kind of self-protecting and nourishing way to go. I'd be really curious to hear how this eclipse is showing up for you. What will it trigger in your personal chart? Let me know in the comments below. And I'd be especially interested to hear your experiences around this ongoing theme of release and endings and letting go and clearing up a mess around the topics of your Libra part of your chart that maybe you've been working on for the last 12 months. Thanks so much for listening again, everyone. It's such a joy to share this time with you each week. I will be back to share more again in the next episode. Until then, take care.